So, William Shire's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. That's kind of where it all started for you. Just to start, could you kind of tell that story of how that book just began unraveling the thread of this book, and then also the moment you realized you had substance here and needed to get this message out?
The book, yeah, came out of this moment where I was reading the Rise and Fall, as you just said, and there was that footnote that he has. Shire puts about I'm not even sure what was footnoted, but it was basically saying that the day that hostilities broke out in World War II, or the day after, when the New York Times printed their coverage, the lead story of the day basically claimed that Polish guerrilla fighters had invaded Germany and not the other way around. And that was something that really kind of like stopped me in my tracks because it's such a crazy thing to say in 1939. Maybe few years earlier, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, you could sort of get away with it. But by that point, like, people understood Nazi propaganda pretty well. The New York Times ran with it in the lead story of that day. That was September 1st, 1939. And it turned out, when I went to go look into this, what had happened, this was actually a propaganda ploy by the Nazis. It was called Operation Himmler. The goal was to deceive other Western, the Allies, who became the Allies, into thinking that the Germans were just responding to Polish aggression. And they basically took a bunch of prisoners out of these camps, the POW camps in Germany. They shot them. They dressed them up to look like German civilians in a radio station on the border, and they pretended that these sort of made up Polish guerrilla fighters had killed the German radio station operators. It was all a lie. And the New York Times published that, printed it as their coverage. They only cited one source for that article, and that was a semi-official German newspaper. It was a propaganda organ. And that was the moment where the coin drops, as they say, and you understand that something had to be very wrong for the New York Times to write an article like that on a day like that. And that's where I started diving into the rest of that first chapter, and getting a sense of really how deep that problem went with the Times in Germany.
Yeah, was there a specific moment, I guess, when you keep unraveling and like you find time after time just straight misinformation that is reported by the New York Times? Is there a moment you go, okay, I have enough here to get a get a message out?
I don't know that there was a single moment for me. I think it was this kind of rolling thing where it was kind of like, let me see if I can create enough material for a chapter or another chapter. And a lot of it was just kind of this mix of browsing and hunting where, just going through lots and lots of books, historical books of different conflicts, and looking at New York Times coverage or how the New York Times positioned a given angle, and just really, um, it's kind of all I did for like a year. Like, every bookstore I went into, every library, every online, I was looking through their archive, which was pretty good for that time. So it was just this kind of a creative process where you're layering on more and more and more, and trying to make sure that each chapter stands up, and that the case that's being made is a really robust one, a really strong one in each of these chapters and each of the topics. And that's how it kind of proceeded until, to the end, where I felt like I had enough to show the case. I think there were a couple chapters that probably could have been included, or more recent developments that didn't make it in. But otherwise, I think it presents a pretty good case study of how the Times operates.
What's one of those more recent examples that's really jumped out at you?
China would be the big one. That's China, and anything that's like domestic U.S. politics, where, for example, the like Biden's cognitive decline, as they call it, or the Hunter Biden laptop, or of course Russiagate. I would say those Russiagate probably would be Russiagate and China are probably the biggest two. Where Russiagate was, um, it was a paid propaganda effort run by the Hillary Clinton campaign. We always kind of use that locution of the Hillary Clinton campaign, but that was after the campaign. It was Hillary Clinton. Let's just be clear about what this was. It was Hillary Clinton paying Fusion GPS to work with the media directly, and Hillary was signing off on specific stories personally. And the New York Times obviously played an enormous role in this. A really, really great investigative journalist named Jeff Girth, who used to be a New York Times senior investigative reporter back in the day, won a Pulitzer. He did a fantastic investigation for Columbia Journalism Review about Russiagate, about how this was done, how the media did this. The media, of course, didn't cover his investigation after he did it. It was a 4-part investigation, but it really shows the depth of their involvement. This is not stuff that you can't just kind of like get it wrong, 500 times over the course of 5 years. Like that's much more than that. That's something it defies anything that could be mere happenstance or even just plain old bias. It's a campaign. It's a coordinated effort, and we know that because there was a point of coordination. There was command and control that was run by Hillary and co, and there was a delivery vehicle, which was Fusion GPS, and the media was just running with it. It was part and parcel.
Yeah, what I'm interested in is in the book. For those who don't know, you chronicle specific reporters: Walter Duranty, Herbert Matthews, David Halberstam, and so on. How have you been able to? What's your counter argument, I guess, to someone who goes, "Yeah, it's easy to criticize in retrospect," or I should say, do you have any do you have any empathy towards the reporters who may have just been misinformed, or I guess I don't know. Yeah, it's because when I read it and what I've heard is like it's easy to criticize these people in retrospect. Mm, Have you dealt with that at all, or what do you think about that?
A lot of these cases were not retrospectively criticized. For example, the stuff that was going on in World War II, that was known at the time by people working at the New York Times. There was a Jewish editor, I write about this in the book, who went to the owner of the paper, or the publisher at the time. I think it was Arthur Sulzberger, and said, "You have a Nazi running your Berlin bureau." And Sulzberger threatened to sue him for libel if he said a word about it. The same thing with the Duranty stuff. I mean, Duranty was being criticized by fellow reporters who knew that there had been and there was still ongoing a famine in Ukraine that was more or less engineered by Stalin for political reasons. And they called him out on it, and they published their own reporting saying that there was indeed a famine. And Durante even went so far as to deny their reporting, saying that they were wrong, that there was not a famine. So the same thing with Matthews in Cuba, where he was promulgating this myth of Fidel Castro as this democratic messiah, as the savior of Cuba, with no evidence to support this. They didn't know anything about him, and Matthews single-handedly resurrected Castro, brought him back from political obscurity to make him into this major figure, global figure. And the question at the time was that, why are you giving so much front page coverage in such a skewed way to this X factor that Castro was? And eventually that kind of criticism pressure on the Times became so intense that they took him off the beat and they put someone else in place. It was too little too late, but they knew it. They knew what was going on there. And even the Times sort of had to admit it. I think they didn't want to, because again, this is all about the New York Times. This is all about the New York Times serving its own interests. And this is, people always say like, oh, and in Germany, and they're pro-Nazi, in Russia they're pro-communist. It doesn't make sense. It's like that. It's analyzing it too much of a sort of a level of naivete, where the thing to understand about the New York Times is the New York Times is and was doing what was best for the New York Times. This is controlled by a single family. It was a dynastic group of people, the Sulzbergers, and their goal was to keep the paper number one, whatever it took. So when you have a pro-Nazi or Nazi sympathetic uh, editor in Berlin in the late 1930s, what that gets the New York Times is unbelievable access to the Nazi brass, people that could give him stories because they trusted he would present those stories in a very positive light to the Nazis. And that's exactly what did happen. And when the junior editor came to the Sulzbergers and said, "You guys got to get this guy out of Berlin," what they knew is that if they took him out, his name was Guido Inderis, they would have no one there who could do that job at that level. They would not be able to get those scoops. And the same thing with Durante. Durante was a little bit of a different case. It was tied more to business interests at the time and the desire to um, open the Soviet market to American financial interest and, primarily in New York. But it was about the New York Times interest first and foremost. And I think this is where, when you say, yeah, sure, some journalists might have gotten caught up in something they didn't mean to. I don't think that was the case of Durante. It was definitely not the case of Guido and Darris. Herbert Matthews, I think, was just kind of starstruck and full of himself, is my read on it. But at the end of the day, this is about the New York Times. It's not about any single journalist or editor. It's about the institution. And it's the institution that keeps making these kinds of catastrophic errors and doing it kind of in a deliberate, willful fashion.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned the Sulzberger family, and immediately after I finished the book, I went around to maybe 20 or so of my friends and asked, like, who runs X? And they all know Elon Musk. And who runs Instagram? And they go, Mark Zuckerberg. And then even like the Washington Post, I would say half of them knew, like, oh yeah, Jeff Bezos. Even to this day, to your knowledge, why is that family specifically so largely unknown to the general public compared to other platform owners?
Oh, they're not in the media. They're not covered by the media. So Musk is in the media every day. He's also, this is something that he really fosters, and he really sort of nurtures this public persona and public image, and he's done that for a long time. The same thing with Zuck and a lot of other leaders in tech, but they've also been scrutinized very heavily by the media for so long. Like, even if they wanted to stay out of the media, they just couldn't. Whereas the there's kind of like an omerta with the media that you can't talk about the ownership too much, and definitely not in a certain way. So you can talk about maybe a business thing here and there, or maybe if there's like a really big failure, like in the early 2000s, the previous publisher of the New York Times is also named Arthur Sulzberger. The current one is Arthur's Arth. It's like a tongue tie. It's like a riddle. Arthur Sulzberger is the current one. His father's name is Arthur Sulzberger. His father was named Arthur Sulzberger. Back to this dynasty thing. The previous Arthur Sulzberger had this massive faceplant where he went out and bought all these TV stations and radio stations, and they lost about $1 billion at the end of the day. So there was some reporting on that, but that's it. Like, it requires the New York Times losing $1 billion, which for a newspaper is an unbelievable amount of money, especially 20 years ago. And aside from that, you don't get any kind of scrutiny. Like, we don't know who the family is. I can only talk to you directly about the publisher, A.G. Sulzberger, and even him, I know very little. We don't know who the other shareholders are in the family, because there's a dual two-tiered stock structure that gives them control of the newspaper, with the company that owns the newspaper. And we don't know who the other members of that family are, and how much stock they hold, and what they do, and who they work for. And if this was Musk and his family, or Bezos and his family, we would for sure know. But you can't really talk about the New York Times in that way. People are scared of them. If you're a journalist and you manage to get a story and get it, past your editor, you might have a book coming out and you're like, well, I kind of want that New York Times review and I definitely want to be on the New York Times bestseller list. And am I going to get myself blacklisted for this one article? And, even if you get again through those like successive hoops to get to that point, you're probably yourself, you're just going to make the decision to back away because why would you? Like, there's just no incentive.
How is there any specific example of how you have faced that kind of that pushback? Because I mean, you say people are scared of them and people don't like taking direct shots at them, and then you do this book, which is a direct shot at the New York Times. So how have you felt that?
My At the time, my job was really threatened by the book, and it kind of blew up some relationships because people the same dynamic in that I just described. People are scared. They're scared that their businesses are going to be hurt. They're scared their clients are going to be blackballed or whatever stuff that actually does happen. I mean, the New York Times bestseller list is a great case study in this because it's considered by the Times an editorial property, which means it's not about numbers. It's not like which book has the most sales in a given week. Obviously, that's a big part of it. But at the end of the day, the New York Times explicitly reserves the right to make an editorial decision about the list to say, oh, okay, well, we don't really want these types of books on the list. They don't qualify in some way. So we're just not going to put them on. And you see this reflected in like some conservative books that have gone huge sales and they don't make the list, and other books that don't have those kinds of sales do make the list. So people are scared. Even like when I decided to do my book independently and went out to a bunch of cover designers, and like one of them wrote back to me this like truly nasty email about what I was doing and the betrayal and treason and all this stuff. And the same thing when I was shopping the book to editors and publishers. The editor, I went to one of the top editors at probably the most powerful talent agency in the US, maybe the world. And the guy just flat out told me this. Like, he didn't mince words. He was nice about it, and I respect him for it. But he just said, I can't risk um I can't risk going up against the New York Times. Like, I have clients. These are book clients, and I need to think about my clients. And I understood that actually. I thought that was like it's a business decision. It makes sense from his point of view. I get it. But that is the dynamic that prevails. And that's why people don't really talk that much about the Times. I think it was more of a thing in the earlier mid 2000s. Like, you'd get more of that kind of reporting. But nowadays, you get none of it, like nothing.
Yeah. I want to talk about Wikipedia, but you mentioned self-publishing. And you're on Substack. This podcast I host is hosted on Substack. And just the practice of self-publishing is becoming so much more popular, I guess. Do you think these models of a more like decentralized media I can't say it's fully decentralized, but it's decentralized in some sort, better aligns the incentives for basically accuracy versus like traditional social media. So like traditional social media incentivizes engagement. Do you think that the decentralized self-publishing model better incentivizes accuracy or quality over engagement?
Um, Not necessarily. I mean, I think it depends on who it is and what they're doing. Because when you look at people running Substacks and um, at the end of the day, they need to find traffic, and they find traffic on X. I think it predisposes them towards being faithful to a particular audience more than, the New York Times might be. But I think that's also part of what happened with the Times over the last 5 to 10 years, which is that they have also moved towards a subscription model. Is that advertising model in media and news broke as you had suddenly infinite inventory, right? You used to have a newspaper and the inventory for ads was very limited. It was the pages on the newspaper. And then you had internet news, and it was infinite ad space. So, and also, of course, news got commodified, and you had the evaporation of geographic boundaries. Like, so it didn't matter if I'd read the news from USA Today or from New York Times or from like the local Minnesota newspaper. It's all the same. Newspapers mostly switched to some subscription models, which is very similar to what people are doing in Substack. They're just doing it at a corporate level. I do think there is some aspect to advertising that is dangerous on the one hand, because you don't know who's paying them or how much. If we knew who was paying the New York Times, you could maybe like factor that in as a reader. And I think that's something that probably should happen, if whether the media as an industry institutes those kinds of rules themselves or if it becomes law. I'm not sure that either are going to happen. But to say, look, these are the people that pay us. Just like in politics or NGOs, like there's certain disclosures that they have to make. And I think the same should be true with journalism to an extent. But on the other hand of that, there is a democratizing effect to advertising, because every set of eyeballs is worth the same value as any other set of eyeballs. You don't particularly care. And with regard to subscription, and this is true on Substack too, and we saw this with the New York Times, is what can sometimes happen is that you start to just kind of like essentially A/B test every piece of content to your subscriber base, and you skew more and more and more toward their tastes and towards their own hidden agenda of your own audience. So, for example, when the New York Times started doing the 1619 Project that claimed that America was born out of slavery and not liberty, it's something that was really designed to appeal to a younger millennial audience of people who are like so fired up about these issues that they're going to actually plunk down whatever it is, $15, $20 a month for the New York Times indefinitely. It can't just be like regular humdrum, like, here are the facts, black and white reporting. The gray that the New York Times earned the gray lady moniker for. It has to be stuff that is so incendiary that someone's going to like open their wallet and put their credit card information in it and be like, I have to have this. And so that kind of content, when you're looking like left of center, it just goes more and more left, and left to basically cater to the 2 or 3% of your total readership who pay you money. And then that's where your most meaningful content goes. So that is probably true on Substack too, where you have a Substack and you're just like, oh, my audience loves this. Like, let's just do more and more and more. And the farther down this one path I go, the more money I make. So I don't think that there is this kind of like silver bullet to solving for bias or accuracy or agenda or perverse incentives or anything like that. But I do think that having a broader spectrum of voices available is a good thing, because the Substack voices become a sort of pressure on the media or on the New York Times or against each other to correct. And you kind of have a sense that if the New York Times, like back in the day, if the New York Times went crazy on some story and they just got it all wrong, maybe there would be some pushback, and maybe if it was really egregious, there would be criticism. But oftentimes, if it was just kind of flying under the radar, there wouldn't be. Whereas today, there definitely will be. There's going to be somebody out there calling them out. And I think that's the real benefit of it. As like it's not in a case by case basis, but for the entire ecosystem, it is it does have that kind of counterbalancing effect.
I think to summarize, what I took away from what you said is that where the money goes, it seems to be on the more extreme ends. So like the drawing reaction from readers is where money traditionally goes, yes? Or the way it is right now. So I guess how yeah, it's really difficult to say. Like, how can we better incentivize objective, like working towards truth presentation of news, I guess. Which takes me to Wikipedia, which is supposed to be this. How do you think, how does the, you've called it like an invisible power structure. How can you just briefly describe how it operates behind the scenes?
Wikipedia, so it's sort of a victim of its own success, and that success being this kind of openness, the open encyclopedia, which for a lot of years is was really great. It's still great because on a lot of topics you get amazing, this sort of amazing condensation, or condensing of information about a crazy, crazy range of topics. But what Wikipedia allowed to happen, partly its structure made it susceptible to this, and partly the Wikimedia Foundation, which sort of runs and governs Wikipedia, allowed to happen, is that it became very easy to co-opt entire swaths of Wikipedia. And when I say Wikipedia, I generally mean political Wikipedia. Anything that has to do with any kind of political topic in any regard, even if it's very far removed. You could have a, 10 or 20 or 30 or so editors who work together. And that doesn't mean that they're like on the phone with each other at night. It means that they're ideologically aligned. They can identify who's on their side and who's not, and they back each other up, and they end up producing an effect that is very much like what I was describing with subscription-based news. Like, you just kind of like, though in this case, you're not catering toward a group of readers, you're catering toward your own interests, and in a way that's more pernicious. There's no filter between that and what gets produced on the other side of it. So, for example, the reliable sources list on Wikipedia, which it governs what is considered a reliable media source when you cite a fact in an article and have to cite the source for it. That was created by one guy, basically, just one day, decided he's going to make this list, Mr. X. And Mr. X made a list that was like green coded for reliable sources, red coded for unreliable sources. And it just so happens they happen to line up really neatly to left wing and right wing. So like even the farthest left wing sites are green coded, and even the most moderate on the right are generally red for unreliable. And what this allows them to do is say, okay, me and my like 20 friends who control this aspect of Wikipedia, for example, American politics topic area, we can now just rely on this list. And we've just created a sort of parliamentary mechanism that gives us a way to import only the facts that are sort of pre-filtered by the mainstream media onto Wikipedia. And there's nothing that anyone could do about that, because the consensus, and again, this was like the core mechanism of Wikipedia, the consensus on Wikipedia in that topic space has already agreed to this, has already sort of ratified it implicitly with no vote, no debate, nothing. And this is the sort of tyranny of the minority. It's like a mob tyranny, where these guys who are coordinated, very dedicated, very smart, they're able to corner the market on a particular part of political discourse. The same was true with Israel and Palestine, where the investigation I did for Pirate Wires about that was showing how 40 editors drastically altered the landscape on that topic area. They did it deliberately. They did it in ways that were sometimes egregious and sometimes extremely subtle. But at the end of the day, the enormous problem here with Wikipedia is that we don't know who any of these people are. And they could be, for example, there was one of the editors in the Israel-Palestine topic area who was really, really working hard to smooth the rough edges of the Iranian regime, and doing, removing any kind of mention of human rights abuses by the regime in Iran, by the government, that sort of thing. And you kind of have to ask yourself, well, who is that person? And why are they doing it? Are they just a fan of Iran? Are they Iranian? Are they Iranian patriots? Or are they operators? Is is it a government employee in Iran? We don't have any idea as to who that is or why they're doing it. And the same thing with Mr. X. When Mr. X did his reliable sources thing, we just assume it's kind of more or less in good faith, but that could be true. It could also really not be true. And it could be that Mr. X is a DNC political operator, or it could be that he is being paid by the Soros network, or it could be that he's just a committed editor who really believes strongly in the value of the mainstream media. And there's actually nothing untoward, but we don't know. And we don't have any way of knowing. And the thing that you see presented to you in Wikipedia that looks very democratic, because like, even though the design is like really basic, it's that sort of basic, pared down, simple, straightforward structure that gives it the impression of being politically like almost translucent. Like there's nothing to see there. There's no politics to see, but that's actually not true.
Yeah, what are your general thoughts on like these pseudonymous figures versus like do you think on Twitter, say, you should have to be under your own name? Because what I've heard is that like both in the New York Times and with Wikipedia and with some of the Substack writers as well, you're for me at least, I'm always skeptical of anyone on Twitter that I read who's just like under a pseudonymous name. And with Wikipedia, we don't know who's behind them. With the New York Times, it's hard to know like who these people are specifically, so you can see what the incentives are. So what do you think about that idea that you should have to write under your own name to be taken seriously, I guess?
I mean, I don't think that's where we are today. I don't think that's the culture. I think we're in a culture where what matters most is these on social media. Sometimes is the quality of the account, but oftentimes it's the size of the account. And an account that has 1 million+ followers, even if it's kind of junk, it's going to have some cachet by definition. There's 1 million people following it. So I think that's just kind of where we are. And sometimes, sometimes it's great because you have someone who's doing something that maybe they aren't able to do under their real name, and they're producing content that is consistent and has some kind of like verifiability, or it's being held to account, or the account is holding itself to account. That's really great and very good for, I think, this kind of flow of information in a democratic setting. Sometimes, however, it can be damaging and people can abuse this, and it gets very widely abused. Obviously, I mean, the Wikipedia stuff is similar. It's a example of this, how it can be abused. And the same on Twitter, on X, where you have accounts that are obviously not what they're presenting, not what they're pretending to be. But that can be the case with people who are using their own name as well. I mean, we saw this with there was an unsealed indictment a few months ago where Lauren Chen, who's a major conservative influencer, was found to be implicated somehow or involved somehow with a scheme by Russia Today to pay influencers online. It was her company that allegedly was taking money from Russia Today and then distributing it to other influencers to post content, presumably that would be sympathetic towards Russia Today, or show their point of view. She didn't need a pseudonymous account to do that. In fact, the opposite. Like the fact that it was under her own name gave her most likely, and again, all of this is alleged because she hasn't been charged with a crime. So it would have given her more license to do this kind of thing because it's the illusion of trust when you have her name there. So I don't think using your own name guarantees anything. And I do think that we also live in a time where, it's not terribly hard to find out who these people are if you really want to. I mean, the sense of security from that people get from anonymity is probably a little bit illusory. It's probably a little bit not as not as secure as they think it might be.
Hmm. Yeah. My last question to you is doesn't have to do with the New York Times, but Jeff Bezos recently put out a statement, not recent, about a month ago, put out a statement saying that it was a letter to the Washington Post editors saying that he was specifically focusing his opinion section on personal liberties and free markets. And I'd just like to know what you think. I guess, what do you think that signals about? Do you think that signals anything about the future of mainstream media as a whole?
I think it probably signals that the beginning of the end of Jeff Bezos's ownership of the Washington Post. It just like I understand why he did it, and I probably agree with it. So that I think the idea was that like you can write about anything in the opinion section of the Washington Post as long as it doesn't trample on the idea of free markets and like like freedom of expression, whatever the two things you said are. Um, because at the end of the day, every opinion section of every newspaper is going to have principles that they stick to and taboos that they don't violate. Like there's just certain things you're not going to say in the New York Times opinion section. Doesn't matter who you are. You can say you can be the head of the Haqqani network of the Taliban, publishing an op-ed in the New York Times, which he did, saying that the Taliban are going to be so wonderful for brotherly love and equal rights for women. They had no problem with that. The guy's a murderer. He's a killer. And then on the backside of that, if you're Tom Cotton and you write that we should call in the National Guard to control the BLM riots, that was a taboo that Cotton crossed. He violated it, and that was not allowed. It went so far as to have the editor of the opinion editor fired. James Bennett was fired for that. So for Bezos to say, okay, this is our particular no-go zone, like, or these are the principles we hold sacred, in and of itself, it's not very unusual. It's not even interesting. What's interesting about it is that the hoopla arose from his selection of those two principles, and not principles like racism, or we're not going to like violate the expression of protesters for BLM. We're going to hold that sacred. That would have been okay. So he's saying we're going to embrace a set of values that the media has not embraced in the last 5 to 10 years. That's what caused the uproar. And that's why I think it's sort of beginning of the end for Bezos at the Washington Post, because you can't rule a newsroom that's in perpetual revolt. And I think that's where they're going to get to at some point. They're going to get to a point where they say, this is not the Washington Post that I want to work for, and I'm either going to cause chaos or leave. And at some point, Bezos is going to, I believe, say to himself, this is more of a headache than I could have ever imagined, and I don't need to be spending this kind of money investing into this thing when all it's doing is causing trouble for me. That's my guess is what's going to happen within the next couple years. But I think for the media in general, it's not an isolated case. We're seeing this with the LA Times, who also another billionaire owner, is a big pharma owner, trying to even out the coverage, the political biases, the opinion section, creating a bias meter on the site, on his own news site. Really expressing a lot of support for Trump officials and the Trump administration generally. I think there's a business reason for that, but the media landscape is obviously in flux. It's changing. It's not what it was 10 years ago. And I think that's the bigger picture.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for talking so much.